My father looked me in the eye the day he handed me the deed and said, "This is your inheritance, take it or leave it." I took it. I had no idea what I was taking. The deed was for 11 acres in central Vermont, a property he'd inherited from his own father and done absolutely nothing with for 15 years. There was a farmhouse on it, technically. I say technically, because 3 of the 4 windows on the ground floor were covered with plywood. The porch had a hole you could put your foot through if you weren't paying attention, and the well pump hadn't worked since somewhere around 2009. My brother, on the other hand, received a check for $240,000. My father sat us both down at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 dinners, slid an envelope across to my brother, and handed me a manila folder with a property survey inside. "That land's worth something," my father said. "With the right person." My brother didn't say anything. He folded the envelope and put it in his jacket pocket like it was a grocery receipt. I drove up to Vermont the following weekend by myself. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just needed to see it without someone beside me making faces or saying things like, "Well, at least you have options." I parked at the end of a gravel lane and sat there for a few minutes before I got out of the car. It was late March. The ground was still half frozen and there were patches of gray snow in the shadows under the tree line. The farmhouse looked smaller in person than it had in the county assessor's photos. And it had looked very small in those photos. Part of the roof over the back addition had sagged in, and there was a tree, not a big one, that had grown up through the corner of what used to be a chicken coop. I walked around the whole property in about 40 minutes. I stood in the middle of the field, dead grass, frozen mud, a rusted disc harrow that looked like it had been sitting there for 20 years. And I thought, what on earth am I supposed to do with this? I called my best friend that night from the motel I was staying at in town. "Sell it," she said before I'd even finished describing it. "My dad wants me to keep it." "Your dad gave your brother $240,000 in cash. Your dad's opinion on this is not relevant." She wasn't wrong. But I didn't sell it. I want to explain something, because if I don't, the rest of this is going to sound like I had some kind of vision, some cinematic moment of clarity in that frozen field. I didn't. I stayed because I was 28 years old and I was tired. Tired of my apartment in Burlington that I shared with a roommate who left dishes in the sink for days. Tired of my job doing data entry for a logistics company. Tired of feeling like I was waiting for something to start. The land was ugly and broken, and it was mine. That felt like enough to try. I spent the first month just researching. I sat in my apartment at night with my laptop and read everything I could find about small-scale farming in Vermont, about what crops made sense on 11 acres, about soil composition and drainage, and the economics of agricultural startups. I made a lot of spreadsheets. I printed things out and taped them to my wall until my roommate asked if I was okay. The first thing I figured out was that I needed the farmhouse livable before anything else. I couldn't farm land I was commuting to 3 hours round trip. I looked at my savings, $6,000, and I looked at what a contractor would charge to make the place habitable, which was a number I won't repeat because it made me feel physically ill. So I learned to do things myself. I watched videos, I called the county extension office and asked questions I'm sure sounded deeply basic to whoever answered. I drove up on weekends and worked on the house with whatever I could afford that week. Weather stripping, a second-hand dehumidifier, 2 gallons of primer for the kitchen walls. A plumber I found on a local Facebook group came out and looked at the well pump and told me it just needed a new pressure tank, which cost $400, and I could have cried with relief. By June I had running water and a bedroom that didn't smell like rot and a front porch where only 1 board needed replacing instead of 4. I gave notice at my apartment and moved in with 2 carloads of stuff and a borrowed truck for the furniture. My mother called that evening. "Your father says you're actually moving there." "I am." "Sweetheart," she said it in a way that meant you're being foolish. "That property needs a lot of work." "I know, I'm doing the work." There was a pause. "You know your brother has been asking about the northeast corner of the parcel. He thinks there might be good timber value." I didn't say anything for a moment. "It's my property, Mom." "Of course. I just thought you should know he's interested." I knew what that meant. My brother had taken his $240,000 and done what he usually did with money. Spent it on things that felt good immediately. A new truck. A fishing boat. A long weekend in Nashville with his friends. By the time I moved into the farmhouse, I had a feeling the envelope my father had slid across the table was mostly gone. I just didn't know how quickly he'd come looking for other options. That first summer was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this story that gets told where the main character tosses some seeds in the ground and everything blooms and it all looks beautiful in the golden hour, and then the money arrives. That is not what happened. I planted a half-acre of market vegetables because it was what I could manage alone. I built raised beds out of lumber I got from a salvage place 20 minutes away. I installed a drip irrigation line that I had to redo twice because I got the pressure wrong. I found a farmer's market in town that would give me a table on Saturdays, and I drove there every week with whatever I had: lettuces, radishes, herbs, summer squash, tomatoes when they finally came in. I kept meticulous records, every dollar in, every dollar out. I made about $9,000 that first summer. After seeds, supplies, market fees, gas, and what I'd spent on the house, I came out ahead by maybe $3,000. If you calculate the hourly rate, it would make you laugh. But I also learned things that summer that you cannot learn any other way. I learned what the soil on my land wanted. I learned which corner drained well and which one didn't. I learned that I could do things I had never done before, hard physical things, technical things. Things that required starting over when they went wrong, and I could do them without anyone helping me. My father came a lizard in August with my mother. He walked around and nodded at things without saying much. My mother said the farmhouse was coming along and remarked twice on how remote it was. My brother didn't come, he was busy, they said. The second year I expanded. I'd met a woman at the farmer's market. She ran a goat dairy on the other side of the county, and over the winter we'd started talking seriously about a cooperative arrangement. She was looking for somewhere to graze a small satellite herd during the warmer months, and I had pasture I wasn't using. We worked out an agreement. She'd pay me a pasture fee, and I'd help with basic daily checks when her farmhand wasn't available. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was reliable, and reliable money is worth more than you think when you're starting out. I also found an agricultural grant through the Vermont Agency of Agriculture that I didn't know existed until I spent an entire Saturday on their website. It was a beginning farmer grant, up to $15,000 for infrastructure improvements. I applied in January. I rewrote the application 4 times. I won it in March. With the grant money, I put in a small greenhouse, repaired the barn roof, and bought 2 walk-behind tractors that actually functioned. The goats arrived in May, 12 of them, white and gray, and 1 stubborn brown one that figured out how to lift the gate latch within the first week. I watched them move through the pasture that first afternoon and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something close to joy. That second summer, I tripled my farmer's market revenue and added 2 restaurant accounts, a farm-to-table place in town and a slightly fancier spot 40 minutes away that wanted weekly produce boxes. I hired a teenager from down the road to help me on harvest days. I started a small CSA with 18 members. By the end of that season, I had paid off the remaining credit card debt I'd carried from before the move. I had $10,000 in savings. The land was producing. My brother called in October of that year. I hadn't spoken to him in a while. We weren't close the way siblings are supposed to be, hadn't been since we were kids, and the inheritance situation had made things quieter between us. He wanted to have lunch, he said, just to catch up. We met at a diner halfway between the farm and where he lived. He looked tired. He ordered coffee and didn't eat much. He asked about the farm in a general way, and I answered in a general way, and then about 20 minutes in, he said, "I've been having a rough stretch financially." I said I was sorry to hear that. "I was actually wondering," he said, "if you'd thought about taking on a business partner for the farm." I set down my fork. "What kind of partner?" He said he'd been doing research, which I doubted, because research was not something my brother did, and that the property might be a good candidate for agritourism, glamping, farm stays, that kind of thing. He thought if we brought in some capital, he could help manage that side of things. You don't have any capital, I said. He looked out the window. I could bring in organizational skills. I didn't laugh. I wanted to. The farm is doing well, I told him. I don't need a partner. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer, but had hoped for a different one. We talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular, and then we hugged in the parking lot and drove in opposite directions. I didn't hear from him again for 4 months. Then I heard from my mother. She called on a Tuesday afternoon in February when I was in the greenhouse transplanting seedlings. I had dirt on my hands, and my back was sore, and I almost didn't pick up, but I did. I need to talk to you about the property, she said. Something in her voice made me stop what I was doing. Okay. Your father and I have been talking. She paused. When he left you that land, the intention was always for it to stay in the family. We didn't anticipate, we didn't realize what it would become. What do you mean? The farm is doing very well, your brother is struggling, we think it would be right for you to bring him on, formally. Equal partners. I stood there in the greenhouse with my hand still holding a seedling. The roots were dangling in the air. Mom, that's my business, I built that. You built it on family land. Land that Dad gave to me, with a deed. My name is on that deed. We know that. Her voice shifted slightly, tighter. We're not saying you have to, we're asking you to consider it. I am considering it, and the answer is no. There was a long pause. I hope you'll think about this more carefully, she said. Your father is very upset. I thought about the envelope sliding across the table. I thought about the $240,000, and the new truck, and the Nashville weekend. I thought about 3 years of frozen mornings and sagging rooflines and rewriting a grant application 4 times alone at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night. I've thought about it, I said. I have to get back to work. I went back to transplanting. My hands were shaking a little. 2 weeks later, my mother called again. This time my father was on the call too, which hadn't happened since I was a teenager, and had done something they considered serious. My father doesn't use the phone much. His being on the call meant something. He said my mother had told him about our conversation. He said he felt I was being short-sighted. He said, and this is the part I will remember for the rest of my life. You have 60 days to bring your brother in as an equal partner, or we are going to consult with an attorney about whether the original transfer of that property was structured correctly. I didn't say anything for a moment. You're threatening to take back the land, I said. We're saying the situation wasn't handled the way we intended. Dad, you handed me the deed. You sat at the kitchen table and you handed me a manila folder with the deed inside it. That's not a misunderstanding. 60 days, he said, and then he wasn't on the call anymore. My mother said, softly, he means it. I sat with that for about 2 minutes after I hung up. And then I called my attorney. I should tell you about my attorney. I'd hired her in my second year to help me draft the restaurant contracts and the CSA member agreements, and she was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner. Calm, thorough, completely unbothered by things that would rattle most people. I told her what had happened. She asked me a few questions. Then she said, "They have no legal basis for this. A properly executed deed transfer is a deed transfer. If they'd wanted conditions on the gift, those conditions needed to be in writing at the time of transfer. So they can't do anything," I said. They can hire an attorney to write threatening letters. Beyond that, no. But I do want to recommend something. She told me to consider placing the property in an LLC. It wouldn't change my ownership, but it would create a cleaner legal structure that made any future claims even harder to pursue. She also told me that going forward, any communication from my parents about the property should come through her. I did both things within the week. Then I waited. 60 days is a long time when you're waiting. But it's also not long at all when you're lambing season and CSA signups and getting the greenhouse cleared for spring transplants. I stayed busy. I called my best friend most evenings. She talked me through the parts where I felt guilty. Because I did feel guilty, I want to be honest about that. These were my parents. I'd eaten at their table my whole childhood. I hadn't wanted any of this. But I'd also spent 3 years turning frozen mud into something real, and I was not going to hand half of it to someone who'd burned through his own inheritance in under a year and showed up wanting organizational skills. The 60 days ended on a Thursday. My attorney sent a letter to my parents informing them that the property transfer was legally sound, that the property was now held in an LLC of which I was the sole member, and that any further communications regarding the property should be directed to her office. My father called me directly, which told me the letter had arrived. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was short and very cold, saying that he was disappointed in me and that I had put a lawyer between our family. I played it twice. Then I went outside and fed the goats. My brother came of the farm about 3 weeks later. He didn't call first. I was out in the field checking the irrigation lines when I heard a car on the gravel lane, and I looked up and saw his truck, the new one, or what had been the new one, now a few years old, coming down the drive. He got out and looked around. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the greenhouse and the barn, and the rows of cold hardy greens coming up under the row covers, and the small herd of goats in the near pasture. I walked over and stopped about 10 feet from him. He said, "You really did all this?" I did. He looked at me and then back at the field. He didn't look angry. He looked like something else entirely, something quieter and harder to name. "I spent mine," he said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was just a fact." "I know. Mom and Dad think I got the worse end." I thought about that for a moment. "You got $240,000, I said. "I got a farmhouse with plywood on the windows and a well pump that didn't work." He nodded slowly. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "What do you want?" I asked. Not unkindly, just honestly. He said he didn't know. He said he'd wanted to see it. He stood there for a few more minutes, and then he got back in his truck and drove down the gravel lane and turned onto the road. I watched the truck until I couldn't see it anymore. I finished checking the irrigation lines. The sky was doing that thing it does in Vermont in the late afternoon in spring, that low gold light that comes under the clouds and lights everything up from the side. The goats were moving along the fence line. The cover crops in the east field were about 4 inches high. My parents and I are not estranged, not exactly, but things are different now. We see each other at holidays. The conversation stays in certain lanes. Nobody mentions the property, or the letter, or the 60 days. My father is paloktori and olders frek. When I've decided to be disappointed in you quietly. My mother sometimes says things that could mean several things at once, and I let them mean the simplest thing and move on. My brother texts occasionally. Last spring he asked if I was hiring seasonal help. I said yes, and I told him what I paid and what the work involved. He didn't follow up, but he also didn't disappear. That feels like something. Last fall I signed a contract with a specialty grocery co-op that buys for me monthly, greens, herbs, a rotating selection of whatever I have surplus of. The goat dairy woman and I have expanded our arrangement. Her daughter started working with me part-time on the vegetable side. My CSA has 41 members this year. I added a second greenhouse. The farmhouse has 4 working windows now. The porch boards are all solid. There's a wood stove in the living room that I figured out how to install myself over 2 full days and approximately 9 YouTube videos, and on cold mornings I light it before I do anything else and stand in front of it with my coffee and look out at the field. My father gave my brother something easy. He gave me something that looks like nothing. I don't spend a lot of time on the bitterness anymore. Not because it isn't there, but because I'm too busy. And also because I've come to understand something about that frozen field 3 years ago. He looked at that land and he saw what it was. I looked at it and I saw what it could be. That difference has nothing to do with inheritance. It's just who we are. The disc harrow is still out there in the east field, by the way. I never moved it. I work around it. Every time I walk past it, I think about that first day. The gray snow, the frozen mud, the plywood on the windows. I think about how far it felt from anything. It doesn't feel that way anymore. That disc harrow is still sitting in the east field. I walk past it almost every day, and I still look at it the same way I did on that first afternoon 3 years ago. This rusted, useless thing half swallowed by frozen ground, Except now I don't see failure when I look at it. I see the version of myself who stood in that field and decided to stay anyway. That decision cost me something. It also gave me everything I have. I've thought a lot about what actually happened here, not the legal part, not the family drama part, but the underneath of it. My father gave my brother something that required nothing from him. He gave me something that required everything. And for a long time I thought that was the punishment. I was wrong. It turned out to be the whole point. There's a version of integrity that's easy to talk about and hard to live. It's easy to say you'd work hard, that you'd do the right thing, that you wouldn't cut corners or give up when the well pump breaks, and you have $6,000 to your name and no one is coming to help. It's much harder to actually be that person at 6 a.m. in February when the greenhouse plastic has torn overnight and you have to fix it before the temperature drops. Integrity isn't a value you have. It's a thing you either do or you don't, over and over when no one is watching. The decision-making is what I think about most, though. Not the hard work. Hard work is just hard work. But the thinking. Applying for that grant. Setting up the LLC. Hiring my attorney when I was still small enough that it felt like overkill. Refusing to give my brother half of what I built, not out of spite, but because I understood clearly what that would mean for the business I was still trying to grow. Every one of those decisions came from sitting down and thinking carefully about what was actually true versus what someone was pressuring me to believe was true. My parents framed it as a family obligation. I had to be clear-eyed enough to see it for what it was. A request to transfer the results of my labor to someone who hadn't done the labor. And then the staying. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Not starting. Starting is a good day. Starting feels like possibility, but the staying when it stops feeling like possibility and starts feeling like just grinding through. The second summer. The third winter. The morning after the 60-day deadline passed, and I still had to go out and check the irrigation and transplant the seedlings and do the work, same as any other morning. That kind of persistence doesn't announce itself. It just shows up quietly every day until one day you look up and realize you've built something real. My brother said, "You really did all this." He meant it as a simple observation, but it stayed with me because the answer is yes. Not luck. Not inheritance. Not someone handing me an envelope across a kitchen table. Me, in the mud, in the cold, over and over, until the mud became a farm. I don't know what my family expected when they gave me that land. Maybe they expected me to sell it. Maybe they expected me to fail at it. What they didn't expect was for me to become someone who could not be moved. That surprised them. Honestly, it surprised me a little too.